So here we have the government of Canada pushing in public accounts, which is accounting. And again, you can have a different opinions on, or you can't have a different opinion on the accounting books. 1 and 1 equals 2. I actually have this argument all the time with my associate from Winnipeg North, who I take great joy in teasing, and he takes great joy in teasing me back, and we have a fun relationship that way. But I asked once in the House of Commons, he was going on about cuts to CBSA, and I pulled out the public accounts from 2016 that actually showed the Liberal government cut spending in CBSA, and they cut spending in 2017 as well. And the member from Winnipeg North got up and said, well, it wasn't really right that I was quoting statistics because these things aren't always true. And I'm thinking, well, you know, public accounts don't lie, so someone is lying. The numbers do not lie. Revenue neutral is not true, and yet the government puts it in to the public accounts. They're lying in the public accounts, misleading parliamentarians in the public accounts, misleading Canadians in the public accounts. We have a government that's reopened the public accounts for the first time in history for political reasons. We have them apparently, I think this year, delaying the public accounts till the day before the House rises to hide the fact that the deficit blew past the failed finance minister's projections, her line in the sand. Public accounts were signed off on December 9th. But the original report had, first go round, had gone, I understand, as early as September 30th to the Auditor General. We knew what the deficit was before it was tabled. But why didn't the government release the public accounts? I don't believe the false reason about the pensions, because again, Public Sector Accounting Board rules that revenue was, the surplus was realized in 24-25 fiscal year. So it would have no bearing on the past year. Zero bearing. And yet they trotted that out as a reason why the public accounts were delayed. I believe the government delayed the public accounts so that when we asked what the deficit was in November, they would not have to tell the truth. When we asked in October, they would not have to reveal to Canadians that they blew past their line in the sand. And I believe that is why when we asked last week, repeatedly, what is the deficit, that the government would not release that information. And it's very curious, again, one of the examples they used was $16 billion of contingent liability, and I accept that, but what I don't accept is what has changed since the budget was released, when they could have forecasted this, and very recently. And it's not the only thing that's very different from the budget, which again was released not that long ago, just a few months ago, and what's in the fall economic statement. And I'm going to read again. I'm sorry if I'm triggering people, but I want to read from the public accounts from 2022-2023, which is 2 years ago, which again, remember we had the $40 billion line in the sand, and we had a commitment to a declining GDP, debt to GDP. The accumulated deficit, the difference between liabilities and assets, or federal debt, stood at $1.236 billion, so $1,236 billion, so $1.236 trillion at March 31st, 2024. The accumulated deficit to gross domestic product ratio was 42.1%, up from 41.1% the previous year. So it's up. The government remains committed to its fiscal anchor, reducing the federal deficit of a share of the economy over the medium term. So again, it is up. The government says we're committed to our fiscal anchor. Remember how many times the fired deputy minister stated they're committed to their fiscal anchor of $40 billion, which of course turned to be $61 billion, but they put that in the public accounts. So what's in the public accounts for this year? The accumulated debt, oh, here we go again. Accumulated debt was up from last year. The debt to GDP ratio was again up from last year. The government remains committed to a fiscal anchor reducing federal debt. The exact same wording in 2022 public accounts. The government remains committed to its fiscal anchor of reducing federal debt. A year later, the government remains committed to its fiscal anchor reducing federal debt. Again, accumulated debt to GDP was up. So here we have the government in its public accounts admitting that higher, they went up, but apparently higher is lower, because when you have a fiscal framework, when you have a debt to GDP anchor, when you have a line in the sand, apparently you can lie about it. You can lie to Canadians about it. The accounting numbers don't change, but you can say that somehow down is up and left is right, and apparently to the government, wrong is right. Which leads into public debt charges. Public debt charges were up $12.3 billion or 35%, largely reflecting an increase in the average effective interest rate on interest-bearing debt, offset in part by lower consumer index adjustments on real return bonds. If you remember, I talked about real return bonds and the public service pension plan. If real return bonds is dropping, the discount rate should not be so high, but I digress. The Deputy Prime Minister states, we forecast in this fiscal year, et cetera, pushing our debt into bonds with a longer maturity ensures that Canada's debt servicing costs remain low. She repeats that in the House. And yet they state that interest payments have gone up. So how much the taxpayers lost because the government didn't invest in longer bonds as they stated they would? Argentina was able, despite their economic problems, able to float a 100-year bond. There's 50-year bonds available, and yet despite the government stating twice or several times, both publicly in their previous fiscal update before she was fired, and in the House itself, don't have to worry about the debt charges, our interest charges, because we're buying long-term bonds. If we recall, a couple years ago, Glenn McGregor, I think he was with CTV at the time, asking the PM about the threat of very high servicing costs, and the Prime Minister looking condescendingly at him in that special tone of his. Interest rates are at a historic low, Glenn. But what happened? They didn't stay at a historic low. They went up, and we see a mass 35% increase in interest payments. I wish we had finance officials here so we could ask how much the out-of-control money printing led to the higher interest rates that led to the higher debt that somehow the government couldn't figure out. If I'm doing out-of-control money printing, and I know I'm going to be doing that, and I know it's going to be causing an inflation, you think I would also know, you know what, insider trading, I'm going to go and push our debt purchasing, bond issuing, far into the future to lock in its lowest rate possible. But of course, we didn't. In just a couple years, 2022, the budget came out. And of course, the budget always forecasts out in 5 years, 4 years into the future costs. 2023, 2024, 4 years going out, they projected $152 billion in interest payments. This was not a long time ago. This was not in 1990. This was a very short time ago. The 2022 budget. We started out, again for 4 years, $152 billion in interest payments, which is a hell of a lot. The fiscal update that just came out, presented by some random Liberal cabinet minister, because I guess Randy wasn't available, $212.8 billion in interest. So interest on the debt in for over 4 years has gone up $60 billion from the budget produced 2 years ago. Think about that. This is how incompetent this government is, that they were out $60 billion. So it's basically 60 over 152 is, 40% higher interest rates to service the debt from just 2 years ago. Came up in the supplementary estimates A. In OGO, we asked, like, they had $2 billion for higher interest rates. It's like, well, the A's come out shortly after the mains, which was shortly after the budget. How could you be out $2 billion to be coming to Parliament just a couple months into the year saying we need $2 billion? Because a couple months ago, we misforecasted what the interest payments were going to be. Like, is anyone in this room, anyone of the 5, 6 people watching, think 2 years ago, I'm going to be out that much? I'm going to work out the exact total. Bear with me here 2 seconds. 39%. They're out 39%. I'm sure the government is going to try and argue, well, things have changed, the economy's slowing. But the revenue, as projected 2 years ago, to the fiscal update, or the revenue increase over the 4 years was 17%, in the fiscal update, 4 years, 17%, and that budget that I'm referring to shows 16%. So they're forecasting basically the same revenue, but somehow they misforecasted 40%. All the brainiacs that we have in finance, all the brainiacs we have at Treasury Board, massive increase in amount of bodies, and yet somehow they were out by $60 billion over a 4-year period. And what the deficit, the interest payments, not just the deficit. I mean, the deficit, they were only out $20 billion on the deficit over a 1-year period. That's almost the same just in interest payments. $60 billion. We will collect maybe $200 billion in GST. So they were out like 30% of the value of the GST in just a 4-year, in just over 4 years, but just from 2 years ago. And again, this is not like turn of the century or perhaps Chrétien Martin era or Stephen Harper era or even early Bill Morneau era forecasting for it. This was the now fired finance minister herself 2 years ago, missing interest payments by $60 billion. That was actually probably the second largest line now in the budget after OAS, greater than what we're actually paying to provinces for healthcare support. So I hope people remember that when they're waiting in line for 8, 10, 12 hours at their hospitals for care, that the government could have been spending, if they planned better, could have been spending money on healthcare transfers and hiring doctors instead of misforecasting $60 billion.